Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is April 19th, 2022, and I'm very happy to have with us today from Jerusalem, Aviv Tatarsky. Aviv is a researcher at Haram, an Israeli NGO whose mission is to render Jerusalem a more equitable and sustainable city for the Israelis and Palestinians who share it, and to help secure a negotiated resolution on the city through sustained monitoring, reporting, public and legal advocacy, public education, and outreach to reorient the public discourse on Jerusalem. I encourage you to check out Haram's website. I'll have a link to that in the language along with this podcast, so you can see that there. So welcome, Aviv.
Hi, Lara. It's good to be with you.
So I wanted to have you on today because obviously Jerusalem has been very much back in the news again. Feels for a lot of us like a rerun of last year. And I want to talk about what is and isn't the same, what is and isn't different, and your thoughts on where things go. So let's just start at the beginning. In recent weeks and even in recent months, there were a lot of people warning about the possibility of an uptick in tensions and violence in Jerusalem as we got into April. In particular, people focused on concerns about the Haram Al-Sharif Temple Mount area blowing up again. So can you first talk about why people were so worried about this happening?
Right, I think in Jerusalem and for the Israeli public, the violent events last May, which began in April with last year's Ramadan, left a huge impact. Trauma is a bit too strong a word, but a huge impact. And now we're coming to different narratives and even misconceptions in the Israeli mind. The blow-up had to do with Ramadan. The blow-up had to do with Palestinian actions, with Palestinian violence and terrorism. And therefore, come Ramadan again, people got nervous. On the Palestinian side, the outlook is different. For Palestinians, what happened last year had to do with Israeli actions. And actually, many Palestinian and Palestinian friends in Jerusalem were very upset by this image of Ramadan being like the religious atmosphere in Ramadan having anything to do with violence. And both sides were apprehensive coming to this time.
Right, and as you said, I mean, obviously everyone has in their minds last year's events. I think adding to it, I saw a lot of people I talked to were pointing out to this confluence of religious holidays also, that this year you have the overlap of Ramadan with Passover, with Easter. I'm sort of troubled when people raise that because it seems to somehow suggest that religious holidays make violence and conflict inevitable, which of course is not true. But it certainly does seem to bring out, I'm thinking, and I'll ask you about violence later, but I'm thinking about the visuals of extremist Jews trying to get to the Temple Mount to sacrifice goats. It definitely, creates a lot of, it brings a lot of things in from the fringes. But speaking of people trying to get to the Temple Mount to sacrifice goats, can you talk about, at the core of this is the Temple Mount Haram Al-Sharif. Can you talk about the ongoing threats and the erosion to the status quo on the sites? And how much of a factor that is playing today. And here, in addition to the visuals of people trying to smuggle animals onto the Temple Mount to carry out ritual sacrifice, I think it's worth noting that, it's not just in the past few weeks, but certainly in the past few weeks, but even before that, you have a higher number of high-profile visits, larger groups of right-wing Jews who are making a very public statement, going to the Temple Mount, praying openly and visibly. And most recently you had, this was, I think at the end of last month, on March 31st, yes, the Israeli MK Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's associated with the Kanists, who actually visited the site. It was reminiscent of Sharon's visit for a lot of us. And a video that was posted the day of his visit, he said, and I'm quoting, "Whoever has control over the Temple Mount has control over the whole land of Israel, and our enemies also understand this." So can you talk about that erosion and threat to what used to be the status quo, at least?
Right. So actually, the story here has to do with things that are actually happening and not less than that with the conceptions regarding what's happening. So I'll try to touch on both of these. But of course, how do we call the place? Is it the Haram Al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa compound, or the Temple Mount? So of course, for Jews, Temple Mount is the holiest of places. Historically, religiously, nationally, the significance is well understood to Jews. For Muslims, it's the third holiest site in Islam. Putting aside the two sentiments, in reality, actually, it's been functioning as a mosque, as a Muslim place of worship for 1300 years. Okay, and when Israel occupied and annexed East Jerusalem, it decided to respect that, not to change it through force, not only out of benevolence, but also understanding that Israel is considered an occupying power, and if it does something so drastic, it will have to pay a price. And what Israelis today do not remember, they don't remember that while Israel respected the situation in the Haram Al-Sharif, it actually demolished a Palestinian neighborhood right next to it, adjacent to the Western Wall, to create today's Western Wall Plaza. So today in the Israeli public, in the Jewish public's mind, Jews have compromised, gave up something very big, and there's actually no recognition of the fact that actually the state in 1967, the state of Israel, actually did divide the holy places. Okay, on the Muslim side, there's you can say a mirror image. They take for granted the fact that, of course, Haram Al-Sharif is a Muslim holy site, very, very important holy site, has nothing to do, no connection to Jews, to Judaism. The extreme views over there will say that the temple never existed there, and very much aware of what happened to the Mughrabi neighborhood that was demolished in 1967. It can certainly happen next on the Haram Sharif. Now, for quite a few decades, that wasn't an acute problem because Israel as a state, the Israeli government respected what we call today the status quo, the fact that Muslims alone can worship at the Temple Mount. And the temple movements, those Jewish groups that wanted to challenge this situation, were very small, very fringe. The Israeli public itself, the Israeli government, considered them as dangerous and not serious. This has very much changed over the last, you can say, 15 years. And the most concerning thing is that it wasn't only grassroots, it wasn't only changing on with sentiment of national religious groups, but actually receiving support from within governments over the last decade, Netanyahu's governments, all kinds of figures, political figures, be it Miri Regev, be it Gilad Erdan, and therefore the strengthening of the temple movements was not only getting more followers and more temple activists visiting the Temple Mount, the Haram Sharif, but also the government making the police change its policy, beginning a much more aggressive policy towards Muslims in the Haram Sharif, towards the Waqf. And over the last decade, we saw a series of steps of deterioration. Now we have a new government. I, for one, think that in respect to the Haram Sharif, this government's policy is different. We can speak about it, but this has not been recognized. And for good reasons, it hasn't been recognized because there's no trust. And then when what you mentioned, Itamar Ben-Gvir going up and making these statements of taking over and control, and extreme Jewish groups speaking about sacrificing, making a sacrifice in the Temple Mount. Muslims take that very seriously. Of course, there are also Muslim groups that manipulate and take advantage of the situation and use it in order to create unrest. But for the general Palestinian Muslim public, they see it as a true threat, and that laid the ground for a confrontation.
Thanks. That's an amazing summary of a lot of years. I found myself, while you were speaking, taking a couple of notes, and I think it's worth reminding people that Palestinian fears about the intentions, the aspirations on the Temple Mount Haram Sharif are not entirely, are not baseless. I mean, I would remind people, sorry, there's people in the background talking, about the Jewish underground in the 80s, which actually had a plot that it was eventually stopped by the Israeli authorities, but sorry, I'm gonna, for 1 second, a well-developed plot. Sorry, this is live TV, right? You can tell. A well-developed plot to blow up the Dome of the Rock. And there's also, I know, the concerns, and I hear this from people a lot, looking at what happened in Hebron after the Hebron massacre, and essentially the reorganizing of the Ibrahimi Mosque, Tomb of the Patriarchs, where you now have a shared space where it is really run by Israel and Palestinians don't have access sometimes, and people, the idea that that's seen as a model by some of the temple activists on the Jewish side for reorganizing the Haram Sharif Temple Mount to have it be essentially a divided space with shared authority. It's not for nothing. Those concerns don't come from nowhere. So
maybe I even emphasize what you said, because again, now if we speak of conceptions, so in the Jewish Israeli public, they would just say, look, these are very extreme movements. The underground, very extreme. They were punished. They were jailed. Ben Gvir, he's in the opposition. He's not part of the government. He's the most extreme right-wing MK and so on. But on the other hand, first, Palestinians, they don't necessarily make these distinctions, just as we Israeli Jews are not really aware of the different distinctions between Palestinian factions. But more than that, there has been support from within the government. You had Israeli ministers over the last 10 years saying again and again and again that they don't agree with the status quo. They want to see a change. We had even ministers saying things like Uri Ariel, agriculture minister he was at the time, speaking a decade from now, 10 years from now, the temple will be built. Ze'ev Elkin, an important minister, saying, I call upon you, I call upon all the Jews to flow into the old city and to ascend the Temple Mount until we, bring back our days of old, and so on. And Israelis, Jews, are not really aware of how serious these actions are, and certainly not how they are considered by Palestinians and Muslims.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. Looking at where we are now, so there have been rounds of increased violence and tensions over and over around the Temple Mount Haram Sharif in the past, including, as we said, last summer. So given all the warnings and where things are today, why does this feel almost predictable, right? And at the same time, what is really new and different? You said you think the current government's policy is different and hasn't been recognized, but what are the key factors in play right now in Jerusalem? And how would you see the situation? How is it similar or different compared to last year, including with respect to the Israeli government?
Right. So at this point where, there have been violent clashes now for 3-4 days, it's very easy to say, look, again, we failed and everything's a mess, just like it was last year. I think it's really, really important to note the differences. Last year, let's now speak about the old city and Ramadan, not only about the Haram Sharif Temple Mount. Last year, the Israeli police took initiative and decided to block the area of the Damascus Gate, the main entrance into the old city, to block it so not to allow Muslims to gather there. This was very forceful, and the police actually used collective punishment and the beatings and the hand grenades against, thousands of Muslims who came there just to break the fast and so on. This went on day after day after day with really, these are things I saw with my own eyes, terrible violence. This didn't happen this year, okay? And not only it didn't happen, so it's the same police, it's even the same police officers. The directive, I imagine, came from above, came from the government. So not only it did not happen, but even when there were provocations by Palestinian youth, the police didn't use it as an excuse to attack the whole crowds, okay? And again, speaking of conceptions, those of us that are critical of the Israeli government or governments weren't quick to catch that. It took quite a lot of time. Everyone was looking out for the confrontations, for the clashes, and there were a few minor incidents that got all the attention. And it took time until people started saying, hey, look, the police is acting differently. And I think it's part of our responsibility if we wish to promote, you know, less violence and more, I don't know what word to say, but more mutual respect. It's our job to recognize these things when they happen and not only look for the wrongdoings that we know very well, the bad policies that are there. Then in the
can I just stop you? I want to ask you about that because I appreciate what you're saying and I appreciate the contrast between last year and this year. But I have to say, as somebody who is, you know, looking at the videos coming out from not just from the Haram Al-Sharif itself, from the areas around the Haram Al-Sharif, from Damascus Gate, I see a lot of violence, and I see a lot of, I mean, you can say it's not the same level of violence, but I mean, the world is seeing video after video of you know, heavily armed security officials basically beating civilians. I mean, you've got, you know, you see someone run by and hit an unarmed woman with a baton and break her arm. You see a beating of a photographer. You see the video, which I saw yesterday, of basically chasing a father and son and literally chasing them like they're not doing anything. At some point you can say, well, we didn't want you there. You've now run away. We're going to chase you down and beat you in front of your child. So, I mean, I think it's, I want to be just, for me, I mean, I appreciate the analysis, but I think it's important to recognize that there are degrees here. And you're saying, I think that the degree of violence and brutality is different than last year, and that should be recognized. But still, compared to a normal way that a security force deals with civilians, it's pretty extraordinary, the visuals that we're seeing.
Right. So two parts to the answer, to the response. One, all the examples that you just brought, which I assume it's the same things that I saw because I recognize the descriptions, are, one, they're horrible, just like you said. Two, they're all from the 3-4 recent days. And before that, we had a week of Ramadan where the situation was much, much better in terms of police violence. So I was referring to the first week of Ramadan. That's one.
Okay, thank you. No, that makes sense. Okay, I understand.
And of course, I have to speak about the police violence, and I want to speak about the police violence, about what went wrong in the last few days. But the other thing is that we are in a I don't know if the word is bind, but we are here in a situation that the occupation is a given. And the occupation is not just, of course, an abstract situation. It has to do with all kinds of oppressive means. Part of them is a brutal police violence. It's actually, we call it police, but it's actually more army than police. And that puts, how should I say, peace workers or peace activists in a problem because I cannot deny the truth of the fact is that the occupation didn't go anywhere, and this government is a government that is not ending the occupation, is not doing anything to change it. On the other hand, in specific issues, in specific policies, there is a change for good. And I think it's important to recognize it. Now, how do we recognize it without, you know, saying, okay, the occupation is good, the occupation can continue? That's difficult. On the other hand, if we ignore the good policies, then we're not able to support them and to encourage that they continue. So it's tricky. I'm not sure I have the right way to do it, but for one, I feel right now it's important to say the government gave directives and did things differently than the previous government. And at a certain point, when things reached a certain point, it went back to the old policies of using not using force, using brutal force, and calling things a security issue, thereby justifying things that are one, a violation of Palestinian rights, and two, I think they are damaging the interests of all.
Yeah, no, I guess what you're saying. I get it. I think it's difficult for probably a lot of our listeners. It's difficult for me to sort of look at this and say, well, the structural violence associated with occupation has actually been better in recent months with the new government, but now it's tipping over back into the old government, because structural violence is structural violence, and this is what Palestinians live with all the time. So I think I think the point you're making is obviously important, and it needs to be understood, though, in the context of a system of structural violence, which is always present. So moving into where we are today. So why did the situation suddenly get so much hotter? Why did it hit this tipping point where this Israeli government went back to tried and true, from its perspective, ways of just clamping down and using the kind of violence that we've been seeing, travel and video around the world? Right.
So, the first week of Ramadan passed relatively peacefully. I think in general, I'm speaking as an Israeli Jew, but I think even if we would ask Muslim Palestinians, they were happy of the situation in the Damascus Gate, in the old city. Of course, the border police was there, the occupation was there, but it was much better than a year ago. And came Friday and the big Friday prayer, where everyone anticipates tensions, and that went well as well. And we had nearly 2 weeks of things, relatively okay. There was violence, the occupation, there's always violence. There were also Palestinian terror attacks with Israelis murdered, and army actions where many Palestinians were killed over the second week of Ramadan. And then came Friday in the Old City and in Al-Aqsa, with that Jewish group saying, we're going to sacrifice a lamb on the Temple Mount. All these things together, so the waves of killings, along with the agitation of the temple movements, created a backlash of Muslims barricading themselves in the Haram Al-Sharif, saying, we are going to block those Jewish extremists. We're not going to let them enter and make their sacrifice. And they were preparing all kinds of barricades and stones that they could throw, and so on. The Israeli police, on the one hand, arrested some of the temple activists, also arrested Palestinian activists. But in as far as how the government treated that Jewish intention of sacrifice, they arrested some of the activists. They had police ready to block Jewish activists wanting to come with lamps towards the Temple Mount, and they did that. They didn't do anything to alleviate the concerns of the Palestinian Muslim public. And when those groups in the Haram Al-Sharif were barricading themselves and chanting all kinds of slogans and preparing the stones and so on, here the police said, and this is something for us to discuss, but the police said this is a security issue. We cannot allow them to throw stones at, for example, the Western Wall Plaza. And the police raided the Haram Al-Sharif. And then when you have huge forces, armed forces of the Israeli special units, and you have the Palestinians who are ready for confrontation, the result is terrible, and it's happening in a place that's supposed to be holy for everyone, and they're just fighting there. The Israeli police is doing things, the Palestinians are throwing stones, and the situation quickly deteriorates.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would also add hundreds of Palestinians were arrested. You mentioned a few. I mean, there are hundreds of Palestinians, and I think for a lot of us watching this year after year, the framing of this as clashes if you watch the Western media and the Israeli media, it sort of sounds like the Israeli police were peacefully standing around and they were suddenly attacked by raging hordes of Palestinians, which is absolutely not what happened. I mean, whatever the Israeli analysis is of why they decided they had to go do this, this is not a clash in that sense. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to just mute this for 1 second. So yeah, I mean, this framing of this being clashes, I think, is really, it's not for nothing that I think a lot of Palestinians, and I think a lot of us as observers, feel that this is framed in a way that is not, it's not entirely accurate. Again, speaking of structural violence of occupation, and there can be all sorts of debates on, whether or not there are real security risks and why Israel felt it had to go in and do this. But the fact is, it feels a little bit like when Palestinians are called terrorists because the IDF comes through their village and they throw a stone at an IDF soldier who's invaded their village. The clashes framing is problematic, I think. I want to actually shift. We don't have a ton of time, and I appreciate how much time you're giving me. There are broader dynamics in play here, right? So I wanted to ask, I'm going to give you a list and you can talk about any of these you want to talk about. What about Jordan? Historically, Jordan has played an important role in helping tamp down escalations around the Haram Al-Sharif when they've happened. This time around, I believe you have the Israeli government accusing Jordan of playing an inciting and support for terrorism role. I think there's been language like that in the past couple of days because Jordan has expressed concern, which is not great in terms of the Israel-Jordan relationship, and it speaks to some broader problems. What about Russia injecting itself into this issue? I believe the Putin yesterday made comments about concerns about Israel's actions on the Haram Al-Sharif, which seems awfully opportunistic to me. What about the Hamas role? Hamas calling on Muslims to protect the Temple Mount as you have, extremists wanting to sacrifice goats and that sort of thing. The other piece that I think is really interesting, I mean, we have the ongoing settler activity in the Old City. We had this major hotel that was taken over a week ago in the middle of the Old City. This is a hugely important thing, hugely symbolic for Palestinians. We have what continues to be what is a shrinking and threatening of public space like the Damascus Gate, where, as you said, this year the Palestinians have been allowed to gather, but there still have been soldiers. There's still videos of people being chased and being brutalized. And then the last piece, which I'd be fascinated for your thoughts on, is the Bennett coalition crisis, because Jerusalem is such a potent issue in Israeli politics, Haram al-Sharif and the Temple Mount in particular. So all of this is happening amidst a moment of a coalition crisis for the current Israeli government. So any of that you want to talk about?
Right. So it's of course, I think one of the problems in the discourse I've heard in Israel in the last few days is that what's happening in the Temple Mount is being talked about in isolation from all other actions of violence, either settler takeovers or state violence or the army and so on, and as if there's no connection. So that's something I think is missing in the Israeli perceptions. On the other hand, the other things you mentioned, like the rift with Jordan and the crisis in the government, here people in Israel and the government officials certainly are very much aware of the price that Israel is paying for a crisis in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And since Netanyahu's governments over the last 10 years created escalations again, people now have enough experience to understand that Israel pays a price for this. And the good thing about it, if we can say good, is that there is really a good reason for a government that is not interested in further eroding the status quo in the Haram al-Sharif. There is good reason to think, okay, what can we do different in order to prevent such escalations? And the challenge currently for, I think, this current Israeli government, can they rethink their security discourse in respect to the Haram al-Sharif? Right now, the mainstream sentiment, not only right-wing, mainstream sentiment and even serious left-wing people, when they speak about a security threat in the Haram al-Sharif, then, the police needs to intervene, and what can we do? And I think the last few days are showing that this is not at all helpful. And that may open people's mind to the fact that the police not only should, but could have acted differently.
So, I'm sorry, I keep musing on different parts of what you're saying. I think there's a lot of really compelling stuff in there. It's a perspective that in many ways pieces of this I find challenging, right? Because I keep thinking of, all right, if you're a Palestinian, Israelis see this in a moment. It's much like what happens with the idea of, cycles of terror. Israelis believe a cycle of terror starts because they've been attacked. They don't care about or even know about or think about the structural violence that Palestinians deal with every day. And so they're not thinking about the constant erosion of Palestinian equities, the threats to them in the old city and in the Haram Sharif, this ongoing sense of being under siege and of things like the Itamar Ben-Gvir visit, I think probably didn't resonate nearly strongly enough with the Israeli public for what it symbolized. So, when I think about what's happening with the coalition crisis and I hear analysis from Israelis like, you've got to make sure that you save this government, because if not, you get a government of Ben-Gvir and his type. I mean, Palestinians know that, right? They know that that is waiting in the wings, and it's not a minor part of the Israeli body politic. And it's a trend in Israeli politics, which it's the sort of like, they tell you who they are, you should believe them. And when they tell you who they are, they say, there's no place for you on the Temple Mount Haram Sharif, it's ours. So it's hard for me to sort of imagine, given where Israeli politics are today and how across the spectrum is the sense that you have to defend security on the Temple Mount Haram Sharif in Israel. It's hard to see how Palestinians would be convinced that things are going to calm down, that their security and their equities are in any way going to be respected going forward. It seems the erosion of equities has been such a powerful trend for so long. But I guess that sort of leads into my next question. I've tipped my hat on what I think, but I guess with all of that in mind, all of this analysis.
But maybe before the next question, I think there's something important to point out here. I mean, all you say is very, very true. And, I heard an interview yesterday of MK from the coalition, and the best thing he had to offer was, just as you said, you're going to get Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir, and that's going to be much worse for the Haram Sharif and for the Palestinians and so on, which is not a good answer. But when we look at Palestinians, we need to see that if I just focus for a second on the Haram Sharif, they are able to contain the situation. It's not that Palestinians, challenge Israel in the Haram Sharif every day or every week or even every month. There has been specific things happening in the last couple of weeks that for Palestinians and Muslims were a red line. And that's why that's the potential that I see. If we are willing to acknowledge that the government did a few things better than previous governments, then we can also tell them, okay, these are the specific things that you did wrong. There is another approach, which I understand and respect, saying, look, the problem is the occupation, and we have to deal with that, and we cannot deal with specifics. But when I'm looking at what has been happening in the last few weeks, I do see specifics.
Yeah, I guess my concern looking at the specifics is in my experience of watching Jerusalem for the past 25 years, Jerusalem is most vulnerable during moments of political unrest inside the Israeli domestic scene, because politicians across the spectrum tend to try to earn political capital on Jerusalem. And it is difficult to see anything, if the idea is that it is a victory for stability and security and the rights of Palestinians, to try to shore up some red lines which have moved massively over the past 25 years and which aren't being shored up in any sort of permanent way. It's a kind of managing expectations, managing the situation. The bottom line seems to be, these equities are going to be challenged regardless of who is in charge, but at least the guys in charge are challenging them in a way that isn't quite as in your face and horrifically violent or brutal as the last government, and it could be worse, which doesn't really sound like a recipe for stability or justice or resolving a conflict. Which again, to go to the, I'm not asking you to have answers. These are big questions, but I mean, I appreciate your perspective. And this is, you know, an Israeli perspective from an Israeli peace activist. It's an important perspective here, and you're obviously immersed in these on the ground every day, these issues. And with all of that in mind, where do you think this goes? This is the crystal ball portion of the conversation.
Right.
You know, things are obviously, there's a concern that things are going to escalate beyond Jerusalem. Last year, Jerusalem actually settled down a little bit while they escalated everywhere else, but the spark was lit in Jerusalem. I mean, do you have any predictions of how this plays out more broadly inside and outside of Jerusalem?
I do not know to say. I think we are certainly at a dangerous moment, and what's very frustrating is that there are things that can be done to reduce the risk, and right now they are not can be done by Israel, and they are not being done. And I think the crux of the issue is just what you said before. The occupation, its oppression, is not going anywhere, and you know, as long as it's there, we can offer, you know, very little. On the other hand, we do see things that are creating a lot of damage. If Israel keeps on, you know, insisting that it's not that Jews enter the Haram Al-Sharif, that's not necessarily the issue, but that police first attack the Muslims in the compound in order to create like an empty space for the temple activists to enter into, then that just deteriorates the situation day by day. In a few days, we're going to reach the last 10 days of Ramadan, which in the past, it was custom that the Haram Al-Sharif is open to Muslims alone. Non-Muslims do not enter the compound in the last 10 days of Ramadan. So who knows, maybe we're just going to hang in there for a few days, and then because things in the Haram Al-Sharif become more relaxed, the tension dissipates, and maybe a big escalation has been warded off. The problems are still there, and if it didn't erupt this time, which I hope it wouldn't, we know that nothing has really changed, and the conditions are there. And also we must remember, you spoke about the structural violence, that even when there is so-called no escalation and we are less tense, the attacks on Palestinians in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, they continue day by day. This government, in that sense, as you know, this situation in the West Bank is as worse than it has ever been in some senses. In East Jerusalem also, that's where we are. That's where we are.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I find myself thinking as we're talking of the images from last year. I don't know if you recall the images when there was a fire on the Haram Al-Sharif, and it was videos of Jewish youth in the Western Wall Plaza, which of course is the site of what used to be the Mughrabi Quarter, which is the Palestinian quarter that was raised by Israel to create the Western Wall Plaza. Most of those people were moved to the Shofat refugee camp, a piece of history that virtually nobody knows. But I remember videos of these kids dancing and singing with ecstasy as they thought they were watching the mosque burn on the Haram Al-Sharif. And I have to say that, you know, as someone who's watched this evolve for years, I am horrified at where the public consciousness has moved to what was, you know, 25 years ago, a marginal far right-wing position. You know, when the idea that someone would have a plot to blow up the Dome of the Rock, you know, was people reacted with horror, recognizing what that might unleash, separate from having any cares for Palestinians, what it might unleash on them. And now it's, you know, celebrating the destruction, what they thought was the destruction of another people's third holiest site. It's pretty horrible, and it's hard for me to see how this is. And I see what you're saying about sort of managing it and trying to tamp it down, but with everything that's happening, how this is resolved outside of a broader end to the structural violence and what most of us are increasingly talking about as not just like occupation, but apartheid. And that's it's such a challenge. It makes it hard to talk about this in isolation, but I understand why it's also important to look at it in isolation to see what's actually happening at the site and right now. So I really appreciate you taking the time and being with us, and thank you for your work.
Maybe I will just say, I'm sorry if I can add a sentence just to respond to you said very accurately and very importantly, and I think one way to approach things is to say, this system, the Israeli regime is completely broken. Israeli society is just becoming more and more racist and about Jewish domination and supremacy and so on. It's an apartheid regime, and we can all the time work against it. And I understand that that sentiment. I cannot say that it is wrong. There is another sentiment saying, look, we have to do whatever is possible to minimize damage. Myself as an Israeli activist, and that's also important for the international community to hear. Me as an Israeli activist, I cannot change the situation. If someone thinks that Israeli society can end the occupation by itself, clear message should be said, no, the Israeli society is not going to end the occupation on its own accord. But me as working here with Israeli society, with Israeli politicians, with the Palestinian communities, I have to take up every fight that I can. And for that, I need to get into the details, which it's not just the bottom line, apartheid and so on.
No, I thank you for that, and I appreciate that. And I think this is something that anyone who works on human rights or humanitarian issues, do you ignore the stuff happening on the ground and work only on the big picture, and then people suffer more, or do you focus on the stuff that's happening on the ground, the small picture, while keeping a keen awareness of the broader structures? I think it's a huge challenge for activists, and I respect tremendously that you're trying to balance that, and I appreciate your work. We're going to stop here. So Aviv, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insights at this critical moment. And for our audience, thank you for listening and watching. And finally,
thank you very much, Lara.
Thank you. And finally, as always, I want to remind people, subscribe to the Occupied Thoughts podcast. This is where I do the quick ad. You can do so on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. That way you won't miss any of the content that we're posting every week. And you can also find this podcast and a video of it on our website at www.fmep.org. And with that, we're going to end this. I'm Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.